Hello and welcome back to the second episode in my series on Firebase. In this episode, I'll be bringing you through how I set up Firebase. Set up Firebase, you say? Why does this video need to be so long? Isn't it easy to set up Firebase? Well, yes, setting up Firebase is easy, but I'll also be showing you how I set it up locally, as in the local emulator. I feel like it's very important that every Firebase project is set up on the cloud and also locally. Every developer should be able to work on their Firebase project locally. Before we continue, I assume that you basically know how to get a Next.js project running. Okay? Cool. So you log into Firebase with your Gmail account and then you create a new project here, add project. And then you give your project a name. I'm gonna call it Firebase Toot. And I usually opt out of this. Creating project. Now that we're here, we have created a new Firebase project. But the funny thing about Firebase is you need to go in to each of the Firebase services and activate them. So we're gonna do that first. In case you didn't know, Firebase has two basic tiers. Spark, which is completely free at no cost, and Blaze, which is pay as you go. Now, most of the time, I would recommend people just upgrade their package to Blaze. It is very unlikely that you will ever exceed the free tier of Blaze, seeing as you're just learning and you don't have a lot of traffic. You will have to link up your credit card or debit card, but as long as you're not doing ridiculous reads and write and calling your cloud functions like 1,000 times a second, you're not gonna exceed the free tier of Blaze. So I would recommend, for ease of mind, just upgrade to Blaze. Don't worry, you won't have to pay. When you select Blaze, right, it's gonna ask you about how you want to pay, blah blah blah, and then it's gonna ask you at what point you want to receive notifications about exceeding some price in the Blaze plan. So I usually just go for $1, right? As soon as it exceeds $1, I know that something's going wrong or something's happening, my app's catching fire or something. So I just do $1, I'll receive an email. I've never received this email because I've never exceeded $1. And purchase. Cool. Now that you've done that, it's basically unlocked all the Firebase features for you. Now you go to each of the Firebase services that you want activated, and then you just go in and create it. For example, authentication. If you want authentication, go in and get started. Then it will enable authentication for you on this project. Okay, cool. Now I want email and password. I'm just going to enable that up front because I know that's what I want. And then I'm also going to enable Google. I'll just enable Google because we're probably going to get into that anyway. Cloud functions. I know I want cloud functions. Get started. So what else do I want? I want storage, test mode, and finally do the same thing with Firestore. Cool. Now you have your Firestore completely set up on the cloud. Now let's get it set up locally. Okay, so I've basically created a folder in my PC called Firebase Toot, and I'm going to initialize a Next.js project here. I'm just going to copy this script and initialize a Next.js app. I assume you already know what to do here. npm run dev, and voila, we have a basic Next.js app up and running. Now let's set up Firebase on our PC, more specifically the Firebase Emulator. Since initializing Firebase and the emulator technically is the back end, some people would separate that into its own directory, separate from the front end. But for simplicity and not to overcomplicate things, I'm just gonna do it in this folder, Firebase init. Now it's gonna ask you, are you ready to proceed? You say yes. And then you pick the services you want. Firestore, functions, storage, emulator, and I think that's about it. In case you don't know, I'm pressing the spacebar to select. And then here you can say use existing project. Click Firebase Toot. Here it'll ask you how you want to store your Firestore rules. If you don't know what Firestore rules is right now, don't worry about it. Just use the default settings. Firestore rules. Firestore indexes, don't worry about it. Firestore indexes, default settings. JavaScript or TypeScript? Always JavaScript. Hello, at this point I wanted to say TypeScript, but I'm an idiot. ESLint? Yes. Yes. Storage rules, default settings. Now it's asking you what emulators do you want to install with your emulator. So you pick the authentication function, Firestore, and I think that's about it. Which port do you want to use? Default. Yes. And anyone, and yes. There you have it. You have your Firebase initialized on your local. Now, how do you get your Firebase emulator up and running? You just do this. Firebase emulators start. And you do this in the folder where you initialize your Firebase project. When you press enter, then on Windows at least, you'll see this window pop up, this console pop up, and then it'll get the Firebase emulator up and running in the background. Now, when you see this, basically it means that it's up. the Firebase Emulator UI is up and running on this port. So if you press Ctrl and click on this, ta-da, you have a little mini Firebase running on your local environment, separate from the cloud. Cool, very cool. Now, you have your Firebase on the cloud, and you have your Firebase in the emulator, and you have your front-end app. How do you link up your front-end app to Firebase? Be it the cloud or be it the emulator, how do you link them up? I'm going to show you. So if you go to your project and click Project Overview over here, you'll come back to the home page of your project. And you see here, you can link up a web app or iOS or Android, but I'm going to hook up a web app, okay? Ding! Now, what's the name of your web app? I'm just going to call it Firebase Tut Web, okay? Then I don't need Firebase hosting, so I'm not going to click it. Register app. Now it's going to run you through basically how to set up Firebase on your web app. So just follow the settings. So you run npm install Firebase in the root of your front end. This will install Firebase on your front end right here in your package.json, as you can see. Now you follow the next step, which is basically to paste this somewhere in your app. Where, you might say? Well, I usually create a folder under source, right? Called services, okay? And then I create a file in there called firebase.ts, okay? And I paste this in there. Everything should be fine. You shouldn't see any red anywhere. If you see red somewhere, you did something wrong. Now, as you can see in my example, there is no red because I did nothing wrong. Now, to be sure that we didn't break anything, we're gonna export this app, okay? We're gonna export this app and then we're gonna see if we can get anything out of it in app right here, okay? So we're gonna console log app. App from where? Yeah, cool. So it lets me import. It's cool. And voila, we can see this thing. This thing is logging out. We can see that our app seems to be initialized correctly. Apparently, it should be. But what about the emulator? I'm getting there. Come on, man. So for the emulator, you want to be able to tell your app that, hey, when we're on local, connect to the emulator. When we're in production, connect to the live app. So how do we do that? So I want to show you something very cool built into Node.js itself. It allows you to differentiate when you're in development and in production. So if you console log this, console log process.env.node.env, you'll be able to see that node.env logs out development, which means it knows that we're in development right now. So you can actually use this to tell Firebase and say, hey, if we're in development, don't connect to the cloud, connect to the local. So how do we connect to the local? Let's go to the Firebase Emulator documentation. So here under firebase.google.com/doc/emulator suites, you can see that it breaks down connecting to the emulator by services. You can connect to the authentication emulator, you can connect to the Firestore emulator, you can connect to the you can connect to all the emulators you want. So what you can do here is, let's say I want to connect to the authentication emulator. Let's see. So somewhere down the page here, it says that this function here, connect auth emulator, is basically the function you want to use when you want to connect to the emulator. So let's use that. Let's copy this and paste it here. So here I can say if process.env.node environment equal development, then I want to connect auth to this. But outside of that, I want to use this. Ding dong. You can do this for all the emulators that you want to use. So let's do the Firestore one. Copy this, paste it here, copy this, paste it in the if statement. And then you can do it for the cloud storage one. Copy this, paste it here, copy this, paste it here, copy this, paste it here, go back to Firestore, copy this and paste it here. And what else do we use? We use the Cloud Functions one as well. Let's do that. Finally, copy this, paste it here, copy this, paste it here, copy this, paste it here. Save. Why is it red? Something is wrong. This one should be app. Yes. Now, you might notice some inconsistencies in these connect auth emulator functions. Why is this like this? And why are these like this? Ask the Firebase team, man. I have no idea. But make sure that these port numbers match the port numbers in your firebase.json, okay? Now, before you run your Firebase app again, you should run Firebase Emulators start. Get it up and running, and then go back to your Firebase app and run it again. This time, we should be connecting to the emulator and not the cloud. I'm not gonna go into too much detail. That concludes the basic setup of how you get your Firebase initialized on the cloud, Firebase Emulator initialized on your local, and how to hook up your Next.js app to Firebase and tell it to only connect to the cloud when we're not in development mode. One thing I also like to do when I start a new Next.js app is to get Prettier up and running properly. So what I do is I go to my root folder, I go .prettier rc, enter, and then I go to Google and search Prettier React, and then I pick the second link here, and I scroll down the page, and I just take this and paste it here, save. Now if I go back here and I press save, everything's pretty. Join me in the next episode where I tell you what we're going to be building. Thanks for watching, subscribe.